Okay, I'm getting breathing, it looks like. Testing 1 2 3, testing 1 2 3. How about now? How about now? Are you getting any sound? What's the issue? Oh. Speak, Father, or forever. He said yes. All right. So I'm going to mute it if we have sound. You know, I realize if I wear it like this, it looks like I'm wearing a bow tie. I don't know. Maybe it's like if somebody picks this video up off the internet or something, they'll say, oh, look, clerical garb. I don't know what it looks like. Let's get our Bibles out. Let's go over to Joshua chapter 21. We're going to be in Joshua 21 and 22 tonight. Big thing tonight that we're going to be talking about is we're going to be talking about a misunderstanding. And I think there's a lot to think about here. I put this chapter a couple of years ago in my sermon folder because I thought, you know, here's a great story about how a misunderstanding or how not being mindful of what things might look like can cause big problems. So I think instead of a sermon, we'll talk about it as a class tonight and get to do that and consider those things. Before we get started tonight, Craig, could I ask you, would you lead us in a word of prayer this evening?
Heavenly Father, we bow before you tonight. We thank you for this time to come together in the middle of our week, word to study together, to do what you give to us. Please help us in our study, help us in hearts and minds, we can have direct understanding of what you presented to us and make applications. We do all our students tonight and all our students. In Jesus' name we pray.
Amen. Thank you very much. So, let's try that again. So let's go to our map here for a second, if I can. All right, there it goes. There it goes. Let's take a look at our map tonight. So our land has been settled. We divided it all up. Last week we set up those cities of refuge that were so important, and we remembered how they were set up throughout the land. Who is left, by the way, at this point? Who hasn't gotten their land? And the answer is, well, everybody has, but who's going to get it tonight here? The Levites. The Levites still going to get their cities. No, you know, one of the things I think is really interesting is the Levite grant was a city, but it was also the area around the city. And I can't remember. Does anybody remember? Was it like 1,000 cubits out of the city? Does that sound right? 2,000 cubits. So it was kind of an interesting setup of the land. You know, the Spanish land grants had a system very similar to this, where they would grant, typically it was like if there was an Indian village in the area, they would grant this village and like the land immediately outside of it. And it was a similar idea, a similar type of land grant. I always kind of thought that was kind of interesting. So these cities were going to be granted out to the Levites. How many cities were there? Anybody remember? 48. Minus the 6 that are going to be the cities of refuge. So 48 cities total that the Levites are going to receive. And of course, we talked a lot about that. Stan got it down as 1 mile. And I think 1 mile is 2,000 cubits. I think that's actually 5,500 or 5,000 feet. So I think you're exactly right. And I think Stan's on it too. So it is interesting how that land and the land grant was given like this. Now, I don't know about you, but sometimes you get a little confused with all the names. So when you see names like the Kohathites and the Gershonites and things like that, it's a little bit confusing. So I thought, let's just take a second. And the reason this matters is that this is a big part of a lot of the story of the Old Testament is who's descended from whom. So let's step back and let's remind ourselves that Levi had 3 sons, Gershon, Kohath, and Merari, I guess is how you would say that, Merari. So he has 3 sons. And these 3 sons then become the lineage of the Levites. And their family tree, I realize that's really small. You know, it's kind of hard to put a family tree up there and be able to see it. But the family tree here, the thing that I want you to note is that from Kohath is descended Aaron. Now, remind me again, Aaron's descendants are the priests. Are all of descendants of Aaron high priests? No. Which ones are the high priests? This is kind of tricky. So it's going to be the lineage of Eleazar to Phinehas, and Phinehas gets that promise that we did back in Numbers, where he says, you know, I'm going to make a covenant with Phinehas, and you know, it's going to be an everlasting covenant, the covenant of priesthood, the covenant of peace. Phinehas is going to be the descendant. But here's the thing. It's not ever specific that it has to be like the oldest son. And that's one of the things you kind of think is, well, it must be his oldest son. But it never actually specifies this. Now, when we get over to 1 Samuel, and Lord willing, we're going to start 1 Samuel here in a few weeks, and we're going to really delve into some really interesting things in 1 Samuel. We're going to meet Eli, who's the high priest, and we're going to find, there's a little bit of a confusion about the family line there. There's going to be some adjustment whenever Solomon comes to reign, and Solomon gets rid of the high priest that was under his father. And so there's a little bit of adjustment there, but in the end, they have to be a descendant of specifically Eleazar, Phinehas. But the rest of them, if you're a descendant of, say, Ithamar, what are you? Well, you're still probably a priest, because it's the descendants of Aaron who are priests. Are the descendants of Gershon priests? What's the easy answer? No. They're Levites, and they have some special things, but they're not priests. The descendants of Merari, the Merariites. That's a mouthful. The Merariites. Are they priests? The answer is no, but they're Levites. And that means that they're assigned to take care of the things of God, the tabernacle, the sacrifices, things like that. We might get a sense that they're taking care of the cities too, and likewise. Now, the reason we need to understand this is that all priests are Levites, but not all Levites are priests. And I think, like I said, that's probably something we can understand. All high priests are priests, but not all priests are high priests. Another thing for us to understand. But it's important because what is it that King Jeroboam does? And you might not remember this story, but what is it that King Jeroboam does when he sets up a kingdom outside up in the northern half of Israel? What does he do regarding priests? Oh, go ahead. He just picked anybody. And that was kind of an interesting thing. In the book of Judges, we meet somebody who may be Moses' son or grandson, but all it says specifically is that he's a Levite, and they say, hey, why don't you become the priest for us? Well, he's a Levite, but not all Levites are priests. So we want to keep that straightened down in our mind, because that's something God held pretty serious. Whenever in the time of Ezra, which is about 800, 700 years after this, whenever they go back to Israel and they're resetting up the priesthood and the temple and things, they got a lot of guys that are Levites, but they can't prove, do you remember this? Yeah, they can't prove their lineage, so they have to be excluded from serving. I don't even think they could serve as Levites. I think, but I was thinking priests, and now I can't remember if it was priests or Levites, but they can't serve. They're put out of that. So that's the important thing to consider. Teresa makes a comment here about the high priest being appointed. So that's one of the things the Bible talks about in the book of Hebrews, that God is the one who makes a choice about the high priest. And Stan makes a comment to say that if you're not the high priest, you're a priest of a lesser sort, and still important, but like I said, not necessarily the importance of the high priest. What do you know as far as what the high priest did? What was the high priest's big job? What was his, really, you kind of think of the high priest, it's not true to say he only has one job, because he had a couple of jobs, but what was his one big job? You remember? Go ahead. Yes, how often? Oh, once a year, right, once a year. So once a year, the high priest goes in before the Holy Holies on the Day of Atonement, and he makes a sacrifice that more or less it's considered the idea that it groups up, or it sums up all the sacrifices of that year. So that's his big job. So, again, that's pretty important. Now, Stan gets it down. Teresa gets it down. Teresa has it going to the most holy place one time a year. Stan has it once a year into the Holy of Holies. So that's that sacred part of the tabernacle. Later, the same name for the sacred part of the temple. Now, in the time of Jesus, what do you know about the high priests? Romans appointed them. So right off the top, we've got a kind of a messy situation there. There's a big question as to whether or not they're, legitimate. We don't know. Tell me who the names were. Annas and Caiaphas. So those are the two names in the time of Jesus. A little further on, do we get the name Alexander later in the book of Acts too? I can't recall. There's another one named later in the book of Acts. But the point is, Annas and Caiaphas. Now, what do you know about Annas and Caiaphas, by the way? That's also kind of, that's not right. Well, they weren't cousins. They were related, though. They were son-in-law and father. So Annas was the father-in-law, and Caiaphas was his son-in-law. But what did they do that wasn't part of God's law? John mentions it. John says, well, that year, Caiaphas was the high priest. What did they do? Yeah, they swapped it out. They didn't serve till death. They were just swapping it out. Now, in fact, Stan makes the comment, it had become a political office. And that's absolutely right. It had become a political office. And Stan makes the point also, he was his father-in-law, and that was their relationship. Well, the point is kind of interesting that still, whenever Paul is in Acts chapter 25, whenever he gets struck in the Sanhedrin and he says, God will strike you. And they say, you talk that way about the high priest. Paul says, I shouldn't have said that because you're not to speak evil of the leader of the people. So it's kind of interesting. Paul still is kind of giving him some respect, even though I really question whether or not he was legitimate at all. We need to know this. We kind of need to understand this high priesthood concept. For one reason, because we need to know why they made such a mess of it and why God was so angry with Israel. And he's going to get angry. In fact, the prophets, one of the things George and I have been studying with the minor prophets that I didn't really think about so much is that the prophets talked a lot about what the worship was like in Israel and how much God hated it. And that was kind of a surprise to me, just how much God hated the fact that they were worshiping him, but doing it with their own priests and things like that. That's a big deal. But the second reason you need to know this is a lot of this is meant to foreshadow Jesus. So like last week, we're talking about that, the city of refuge, that's pointing to Jesus. That's talking about how Jesus is, the establisher of the city of refuge, and his death is something that transforms and changes us. And so, that, by the way, if you say, Brian, is there a doctrinal importance to that? Sure. Once saved, always saved. Because if the church is the city of refuge, if you leave, or if the city of refuge is the kingdom of heaven and you leave, what happens? Yeah, you're lost. You die. Once saved, always saved. So yeah, it is significant that we know these things. So as we go through here and we're looking at this list, we're not going to read this one. We're going to read chapter 22, but we just go through the list, all the distribution of these cities. But it's the very end that's super important. The very end of the chapter here is the part that gets super important. So I need somebody who is willing to read verses 43, 44, and 45. 43, 44, 45. 43, 44. George is in. 43, 44, and 45.
So the Lord gave to Israel all the land in which he had sworn to give to their fathers, and they took possession of it and dwelt in it. The Lord gave them rest all around, according to all that he had sworn to their fathers. And not a man of all their enemies stood against them. The Lord delivered all their enemies into their hand. Not a word failed of any good thing which the Lord had spoken to the house of Israel. All came to pass.
Very good, George. Let me just bring out a comment real quick that Teresa had made before we started reading. She had said, don't you think God is angry now also because many profess to serve and worship him, but not according to his will? Yes. Again, that's a very important practical application, 2021 kind of thing. When you understand that worshiping God the wrong way is still offensive to him, even if it is God you're worshiping, like the northern tribes were. So that Teresa's comment's real good for us to think about. So George just read something, and I said it was really important. So the question is why? Why is this such an important statement? Why is it you kind of actually need to know that the Bible says this? This is a verse you might underline in your Bible, if you underline verses in your Bible, because this is a really important statement. And so the question is why? Why are you so important about this, Monique?
I think maybe perhaps because people say that Israel didn't get their land, or all of their land.
Yes. So Monique honed in on it. This is about the doctrine of premillennialism, which is a pretty common Protestant doctrine. A lot of Protestants believe the idea is that God, has yet to establish his kingdom. And they hang a good deal of this saying that the country of Israel and the physical land of Israel is still something important to God, that they're still a separate people, that they're still special to God. Just Somebody just the other day, somebody I knew was posting, hey, you need to, if you want to be blessed, you've got to pray for the peace of Israel. And they'll quote Genesis chapter 12 or something like that. This is really important because if you say, wait a second, why would Israel still be special? And they'll say, especially when we say, that place has been done away with by the law of Christ. They'll say because God's promise to Abraham and to Israel hasn't yet been fulfilled. I found one nice commentator said it like this: the promise to Abraham regarding the boundaries and duration of the possession of the promised land by the nation of Israel are hotly declared unfulfilled by premillennial adherents. Now, this verse is a killer to premillennials, these statements, because it's not just a single verse that somebody says, well, you're taking it out of context. It is the summary of 5 chapters of the Reubenites get this, and the Gadites get this, and Judah gets this, and the Levites get this. God going through very specifically, very methodically, and issuing out the land like he said. And the summary is very specific. Nothing God promised wasn't fulfilled in this moment. Now, that's a pretty all-encompassing statement. Not a word failed of any good thing which the Lord has spoken to the house of Israel. So here it is, just as broadly declared as it could be. This is, and by the way, somebody says, well, in fact, I read one commentator try to get around this by saying, well, wait a second, God said this to the Israelites, but we're talking about the promises to their ancestors, to Abraham. Verse 42, it was the promise he made to their fathers, Abraham. So the big idea here is this verse is really important to know. If somebody says, well, I think Israel's still a special country. And one reason they may come out of that is they may say, well, God never actually fulfilled the promise to give them all this land. And you say, hey, let's go right here and let's understand. God says, I did everything I said I would do. Everything that God promised to Abraham about the land came true. Now, what was the only thing that God promised Abraham that hadn't come true? The seed promise. And, you can jump over to Galatians. You can, a lot of places deal with that seed promise and make it clear that we're the children of Abraham. We're the children of Abraham. Stan has a comment here. Stan says, many evangelical Christian leaders today teach that the land promise was only finally fulfilled in 1948. So pretty common. A lot of people are going to say that. It was only fulfilled in 1948. George?
Interesting, all these people claiming to be Jews can't prove it.
Yeah, fascinating. Fascinating that you couldn't have a priesthood today because ever since the Romans destroyed everything, there hasn't really been any way of proving that lineage. So one important point about what George says there is that if there was to be a restoration of the temple, by the way, that's a premillennial doctrine, what priests can serve in it? Because, no one knows. And if Ezra excluded priests who were Levites, but they weren't sure about their priesthood, how much more so, would anybody else be excluded? There's a lot to be said there. Yeah, that they actually build a temple. And there's a group of folks that are a little bit opposed to them building a temple, that they called the Muslims, that have built their shrine on the same spot. So that's just a terrific amount of irony, I think. Divine irony, if you would. Anthony, go ahead.
Also, I'm thinking about Deuteronomy chapter 28, when we talk about the promises, the blessing of the obedience, and then what happens if they disobey.
Yeah.
And they showed exactly what happened.
Yeah.
They did everything that God commanded them to do to Joshua and up to David, and then pretty much, between the judges, and then you got David, but then after that, then they slowly disintegrated into exactly what was going to happen. What Moses said what was going to happen, and then his life versus the Israelites.
Yeah.
And that they will go, in the end, it's going to lose the promises that God
Yeah.
gave them.
Yeah.
And so here, they got the promise, they got the land, they got everything that God promised them, and then they lost it because they disobeyed.
Yeah.
And so, premillennialism to say that, hey, you know what, Israel has the capital promise yet.
Mhm.
Here again, he's saying, no, they did. So how can you say that it's still unfulfilled?
Yeah. Let's add something to it. Stephen, can I pick on you for a second? You've been studying something in the last week. And if somebody comes back and he says, well, wait a second, Anthony, that's called an everlasting promise. How would you answer that? Stephen, do you remember we talked about study this? Yeah. Yeah. Somebody comes back. And by the way, people say this a lot. Well, it's everlasting. Every single covenant in the Bible is called everlasting because that's what you call a covenant. It lasts till you break it or you fulfill it. But all covenants are called everlasting. So, you know, it's somebody throws that back at you. They don't really know what they're talking about. Go ahead, Stephen.
One thing about this particular subject, people are not studying on that, but the Israelites did not fully conquer the land that they were given by God.
Right.
And that comes back to bite them in Judges.
Yes.
They are attacked by their enemies mercilessly throughout the whole book. And much of it can be traced back to their having taken slaves or not even conquered fully the land.
Mm-hmm. Very good. You know, what's interesting about that lack of conquest here, something interesting, I know we don't have time to go into this, but I'm going to do it anyway. About a year and a half ago, all the news outlets jumped on the finding of some DNA specialist. He was digging up Canaanite bodies in Israel, and he tested their DNA, and then he tested people that live there today, and guess what? They're related. So every single news outlet out there ran this story and said, the Bible's wrong, the Canaanites survived. And it was funny because it was Evolution Today magazine. Evolution Today. And I don't mean that they're not, you know, being witty with their name. They are on Evolution Today that said, hey, we hate to be the ones to say this, but actually the Bible says very specifically they didn't do it. So again, it's one of those times where, you know, you just marvel at the ignorance of some people, but everybody ran with it. Like I said, it got picked up by a whole bunch of news outlets about this. Once again, the Bible's proven wrong story that everybody runs with. And like I said, ironically, it ended up being, you know, our adversaries, the evolutionists, that said, well, that's actually not what the Bible says. So it's an important point to understand that they did not fully conquer the land like they were supposed to. Teresa says it's an everlasting covenant, and the promise is part of that. It ends when the covenant ends. And again, that's a part of the lack of understanding that a lot of people have. So this is an important verse. I want you to have marked it in your mind. Like I said, if you do write in your Bible, this is a great one to underline because it's a place where you want to go when somebody says, well, you know, God's promise was fulfilled in 1948. Then why did God say it was fulfilled in, you know, 1450, whatever year this was, 3,500 years ago? So it's good to know. Let's go ahead and go to chapter 22 now. Chapter 22. I wanted to read chapter 22. I'm sitting here thinking maybe 34 verses. So let's go ahead and break it up. And I'll read 7 verses. And if I can get some guys to pull up 7 verses, I'm going to start with Lamar and go to Craig and Ryan. Jump to Stephen. So 1, 2, and then Anthony. And I think that's 7 each. And I'll try to call them out as we go. But I'm going to read the first 7 and then go to Lamar for the next 7. Then Joshua called the Reubenites, the Gadites, and the half-tribe of Manasseh, and said to them, you have kept all that Moses, the servant of the Lord, commanded you, and have obeyed my voice in all that I commanded you. You have not left your brethren these many days up to this day, but have kept the charge of the commandment of the Lord your God. And now the Lord your God has given rest to your brethren, as he promised them. Now, therefore, return and go to your tents and to the land of your possession, which Moses, the servant of the Lord, gave you on the other side of the Jordan. But take careful heed to do the commandment and the law which Moses, the servant of the Lord, commanded you, to love the Lord your God, to walk in all his ways, to keep his commandments, to hold fast to him, and serve him with all your heart and with all your soul. So Joshua blessed them and sent them on their way, and they went their tents. Now, to half the tribe of Manasseh, Moses had given a possession in Bashan. But to the other half of it, Joshua gave a possession among their brethren on this side of the Jordan, westward. And indeed, Joshua sent them away to their tents. He blessed them. Go ahead and pick that up, Lamar.
And spoke to them, saying, return with much riches to your tents, with very much livestock, with silver, with gold, with bronze, with iron, and with very much clothing. Divide the spoil of your enemies with your brethren. So the children of Reuben children of Gad, and half the tribe of Manasseh returned and departed from the children of Israel at Shiloh, which is in the land of Canaan, to go to the country of Gilead, to the land of their possession, which they had obtained according to the word of the Lord by the hand of Moses. When they came to the region of the Jordan, which is in the land of Canaan, the children of Reuben, the children of Gad, and half the tribe of Manasseh built an altar there by the Jordan, a great and impressive altar. Now the children of Israel heard someone say, Behold, the children of Reuben, the children of Gad, and half the tribe of Manasseh have built an altar on the frontier of the land of Canaan, in the region of the Jordan, on the children of Israel's side. And when the children of Israel heard of it, the whole congregation of the children of Israel gathered together at Shiloh to go to war against them. Then the children of Israel sent Phinehas, the son of Eleazar, the priest of the children of Reuben, to the children of Gad, and half the tribe of Manasseh, into the land of Gilead, and with him 10 rulers, one ruler each from the chief house of every tribe of Israel, and each one was the head of the house of his father among the divisions of Israel.
Great, 15 through 21.
They came to the sons of Reuben, and to the sons of Gad, and to the half tribe of Manasseh, to the land of Gilead, and they spoke with them, saying, Thus says the whole congregation of the Lord, What is this unfaithful act which you have committed against the God of Israel, turning away from following the Lord to this day, by building yourselves an altar, to rebel against the Lord this day? Is not the iniquity of Peor and Nephoros, from which we have not cleansed ourselves to this day, although a plague came on the congregation of the Lord, that you must turn away this day from following the Lord? If you rebel against the Lord today, you will be angry with the whole congregation of Israel tomorrow. If, however, the land of your possession is unclean, then cross into the land of the possession of the Lord's tabernacle stand, and take possession among us. Only do not rebel against the Lord, or rebel against us by building an altar for yourselves, besides the altar of the Lord our God. Did not Achan, the son of Zerah, act unfaithfully in the things under the ban, and wrath fall on all the congregation of Israel? And that man did not perish alone in his iniquity. Then the sons of Reuben and the sons of Gad and half tribe of Manasseh answered and spoke to the heads of the families of Israel.
Ryan, 22 through 28.
The Lord God of gods, He knows, and let Israel itself know, if it is in rebellion or treachery against the Lord, do not save us this day. If we have built ourselves an altar to turn to following the Lord, or if to offer on it burnt offerings, grain offerings, or if to offer peace offerings on it, let the Lord himself provide our account. But in fact, we have done it in fear, for a reason, saying, the time will come, your descendants may speak to our descendants, saying, What have you to do with the Lord God of Israel? For the Lord has made Jordan a border between you and us, the children of Reuben and the children of Gad. You have no part in the Lord. So your descendants will make our descendants cease to fear the Lord. Therefore we said, Let us now prepare to build ourselves an altar, not for burnt offering or sacrifice, that it may be a witness between you and us and our generations after us, that we may perform the service of the Lord before him with our burnt offerings, with our sacrifices, and with our peace offerings, that your descendants may not say to our descendants, the time to come, you have no part in the Lord. Therefore we said that it will be. So they say this to us for our generations in time to come, that we may say, Here is the replica of the altar of the Lord, which our fathers made, though not for burnt offerings or for sacrifices, but it is a witness between you and us.
Stephen, 29, I guess through the end of the chapter, somebody mathed wrong for yourself.
Far be it for us that we should rebel against the Lord and turn away from following the Lord this day, by building an altar for burnt offering, for grain offering, and for sacrifice, besides the altar of the Lord our God, which is before his tabernacle. So when Phinehas the priest and the leaders of the congregation, even the heads of the families of Israel who were with him, heard these words, which the sons of Reuben and the sons of Gad Phinehas, the son of Eleazar, the priest, sent to the sons of Reuben, and to the sons of Gad, and to the sons of Manasseh, to make you know that the Lord is among us, because you have not committed this unfaithful act against the Lord. Now you may be delivered. Now you have delivered the sons of Israel from the land of the Lord. And Phinehas, the son of Eleazar, the priest, and the leaders, returned from the sons of Reuben, and from the sons of Gad, and the land of Gilead, to the land of Canaan. The sons of Israel brought back word to them. The word pleased the sons of Israel, and the sons of Israel blessed God. And they did not speak of going up against the Lord to destroy the land of the sons of Reuben and the sons of Gad were living. The sons of Reuben and the sons of Gad called their altar witness, for they said, it is a witness between us and the Lord is.
So kind of a summary of what we looked at here, the tribes east of the river, the tribes on the eastern side, Manasseh, Gad, half of Manasseh, Gad, and Reuben, built an altar there by the Jordan, a great, impressive altar. And the children of Israel heard about this, and they sent Phinehas and 10 rulers over there. Phinehas confronts them. He says, what treachery is this you've committed against the God of Israel? You've built an altar. And their response is, well, let us now prepare to build ourselves an altar, not for burnt offering or sacrifice, but that it may be a witness between you and us in our generations. Phinehas' response, this day we perceive that the Lord is among us, because you have not committed this treachery against the Lord. So there's something I find really interesting here about this whole account, and that is, again, it speaks to a big idea that we got just a moment ago, and it's worth enforcing one more time, that well, let me jump ahead to the questions, actually. Let me just go ahead and grab those. That old slide should have been in there. What other monuments, first question was, what are the other monuments that have been built on the Jordan River? What do you got?
Where they cross the river to enter the-
Where they crossed the river, how many monuments were there? Monuments were there. Yeah, there's one. Well, there's three, because there's one in the river, there's one at the side of the river, and then there's one at Gilgal. So that's really interesting. We already have a monument there. Now, it doesn't say that this is the same place they crossed. So, in fact, I would kind of guess it isn't. It just talks about them going through Gilead. So I would assume it's not the same place that they crossed. George? Yeah. Well, so what's interesting is, again, I want to wait a second before we talk too much about the altar. So the rest of Israel hears about this, and they say, that's it, it's war. Now, the first time I read this years and years ago, I thought, talk about an overreaction. I mean, they built an altar, we're going to go destroy them. But why? Why is it that they jump up on this and say, hey, you know what, we're going to have to do something about this, and it means war? Why? Stephen?
I think they're reflecting on what Achan had done and how that affected the rest of Israel, the consequence of his disobedience.
So there's two good examples that are brought up here. He says, hey, don't you remember Baal Peor? You know what happened there? Don't you remember Achan? In both of those circumstances, a few people were doing something, or, Baal Peor was a lot of people were doing something, and everybody suffered for it. A plague came through, and a lot of people died for it. Achan sinned, and a lot of our soldiers died because of his sin. So it makes sense then that Phinehas is saying, wait a second, if you do this, then, you're really going to destroy all of us. Stan's got a comment here. Stan says, if they believe the 2.5 tribes had deserted God, if the sin of Achan caused God's anger, how would he react to the departure of 2.5 tribes? Teresa goes on to say, because of past events, God held them all responsible when one sinned. Now, Stephen Root throws this out, and I really like this, because this is going to be my does that seem fair to you statement. Little leaven leavens the whole lump. Is it really fair that God would punish a whole bunch of people because one man sinned? Now you're thinking there because you're thinking, well, I don't think it is fair. Well, in a sense, there's some ways it's not. God says we each are accountable for our own sin. But how does this fit? And what I want to come back to here in just a couple of moments is to say, how does this fit like with the church? Stephen's quote there is actually from 1 Corinthians, where Paul is talking about there being somebody living in sin among them. And it's really important that we make the connection of how this relates to things with the church. So, is that fair? Well, it doesn't matter if it's fair or not. Phineas says that's what's going to happen. That's the point of what's going to happen here. So why did they send Phineas? Go ahead.
Well, I think this whole thing is, they use the word altar. Altar refers to worshiping God.
Mm-hmm.
There was a prescribed place to worship God. And to me, that's what they were upset about, because they had created another place to worship.
Yeah.
But they called it a memorial. I mean, that's what it was. It wasn't an altar.
And so let's even say this. It's not just an altar. What's specified about it? What's the word that's used? Replica. It's a replica of the altar at the tabernacle. So, like I said, if you saw it, that would be, you would probably pick it up right away. That would be the thing that would grab you. So,
And then the question regarding Phineas, he's involved with the worship of God.
yeah. So he's the heir apparent for the high priest. And at this point, it's not, Eleazar is going to be mentioned one more time, I think. So it doesn't seem like Eleazar has died. But, in Judges, it's Phineas that's actually going to be the guy that leads them to war against which tribe? Anybody remember in Judges? Yeah. So it's kind of, it's kind of weird because Judges is out of order chronologically. It's towards the end of the book of Judges, but you read that this same guy leads the tribes in war against another tribe. So that's kind of interesting that he had this near one, and then he'll later on actually have a war against one of the tribes, and they'll nearly wipe out the tribe of Benjamin. And that's an interesting event that they're going to have to as well. Who else did they send? 10 leaders, yeah, that went out with them. So 10 of the men that were leaders. So what is the sin that it looks like they've done? So here's the thing to think about, though, and this is a really important for us today thing. What was it that it looked like they were doing? Let me ask you like this. Did it look like they were turning to paganism?
Creating another place of worship of God.
Yes, it's not paganism. It's not heathenism. It's not Baal worship. It's worshiping Jehovah. But what it looks like is they're going to worship God different from the way that God has said. I've got a comment here, and I've lost it. I've already got past it. But one of the points that was made a little earlier is that when God specifies something, even if you have good intention, the point is you do it the way God said. And you think today of worship and how many people say, well, as long as your heart's in it, as long as it's towards God, that's fine. But one of the things God really hated was when they worshiped him their own ways. So it really is a big deal that we just do things our own way. That really is something that God is really offended of. And the other Israelites knew it. Kind of a neat thing, by the way. What was it Phineas said? He says, if your land is polluted, what did he tell them to do? And that was kind of a strange thing. And I'm not even sure I understand why he said that. But he says, if your land's polluted, what should you do? What do we read there? Come back. Yeah, get over here. I'm not sure exactly why he said that. One of my thoughts was, well, polluted means what? I know what polluted means. Corrupted by what? Sin, idolatry. If you go over there and everybody turned to paganism, well, come back. But this idea of building the altar there, what the connection is to that statement isn't entirely clear. But the point is, Dan says it too. Come on over. Come back with us was what he had suggested. Now, let me ask your opinion question. You think this was a smart idea to begin with? So, Stephen, what do you got? What do you think?
Christians do. And the reason they do is because in those generations, just as they said, they made the decision that because they're on the other side of Jordan from the rest of Israel, that they they had done this, temple, or not temple, but what was it again?
Yeah, the tabernacle at that time, yeah. The altar, I'm sorry, they built the altar, yeah.
Right, as a witness. Really, so that their descendants would understand they're still part of Israel.
You know, so it really is significant because they say, what happens when, generation from now, your kids don't recognize our kids and they don't want us to come back? And it kind of, there's a little bit of sense to saying, if we can point to this altar and say, look, isn't that the exact same altar you worship at? We built that to show that we belong over here. Well, there's a little bit of sense to that then. There's a little bit of sense. What else do you think, Debbie?
Well, it was kind of a bad idea because they didn't really tell anybody on the western side. And then people on the western side just jumped to conclusions and didn't do any investigation on their own. Just listened to everybody else and all their gossip. And so that was kind of bad part of it. They should have, put a messenger up there instead of building this altar for this reason.
So Teresa says the same thing. Teresa says perhaps they should have told the others what they planned to do beforehand, and maybe they could have decided then if it was a good idea. Ryan? That's right. That's a good point. Yeah. A very astute observation, Ryan, because that is a good point. They were supposed to be going 3 times a year. I hate to say it, Ryan, but there's kind of a planned, we're probably not going to be doing that in some of this. And we know the Israelites were really bad about this, that they didn't keep the feasts like they were supposed to. So that's an important point to consider. I want to say in the last couple of minutes, let's take this and let's put it to the church. I missed a lot of comments online, and I'm sorry about that. But Stephen Root says, and makes a statement to say, he says, this reminds me of a practice used in the Marines. When one Marine messes up, the whole unit is punished to increase discipline, and unit cohesion. I want to kind of talk again about that because I think it's important as we apply this to the church. Grant made an observation about why they might have built the altar. He says, well, maybe he thinks they built the altar to make the land more holy, that there was some sense of, that they thought they could, purify the land. I hadn't thought of that. That's a good comment. Let's apply this to the church. What do we call it when we do something, and even if it's not intended to cause this, it causes somebody else to get really upset or somebody said it. Stumbling block. What does the New Testament say about stumbling blocks? Woe to the man who sets him before others. Yeah, I would have accepted bad. They're a bad thing. Now, I'm going to be careful to say, we got to be careful. Even Jesus acknowledged he gave a lot of stumbling blocks. In fact, he said, I am a stumbling block. So, it's not as though we don't, any stumbling block is wrong, but a needless or vain stumbling block is significant. So one of the things that strikes me about this story is, number one, here's a group of people that said, hey, we're going to do something, and it should have probably been something you realized could be a stumbling block for the rest of your brethren, that they could do this. What are some other bad things that could happen with this altar? It's pretty classic of the Israelites to do things like this. What could they have done with it? Hey, there's a big altar here. What? Yeah, let's get to use with. Let's use it. You're basically building an opportunity for another generation to come along and do something bad. I'm going to put this on the bad idea club. But like I said, it's just an opinion because I'm thinking, the propensity of falling and worshiping is just a constant point that we want to consider. So number one, there's a lesson here about stumbling blocks that, avoid it. Don't do it. Don't create it. Number two, there's a lesson about, again, like we've seen several times, one sinful person in a group of Christians can really do some damage. We're responsible for each other. And part of that responsibility is, if one of us is going into error, what are we supposed to do? Snatch them out. If we don't, suddenly we all become guilty. What's the story in the Old Testament? I realize you're going to have to read my mind for a moment, where God told one of the prophets, hey, if you see danger and you don't warn everybody, Ezekiel 33, very good. Ezekiel 33, Ezekiel's told, you're a watchman. If you see danger and you don't warn people, their blood's on you. Well, that's us. If one of us goes astray, we're all bound together. We're again, getting to heaven on the team sport. If we're, help me out, Craig, we're playing baseball together, and somebody's using drugs that are going to get us in trouble, if the rest of the team just goes along with it, what happens to that team at the game? I think, maybe. What's that? We'll go with disqualified things. They're out. Well, what if we get to heaven as a group, What if we're all standing together? What if that's how the line is at heaven? We're all together, and they say, guess what? You guys knew that one of you wasn't going to make it, and you didn't care to do anything about it. You're all disqualified. That's not a crazy idea when you appreciate the idea that we do have an obligation to each other. So it's important to understand that. Michael wants to ring the bell. He wants to ring it, and that's just terrible on his part. But it really does bring us to our close. I'll get one last comment, and then we're wrapped up. Yeah, that's a great observation. I'm going to get one last comment here because Teresa made a really good observation that's worth bringing out. She says, so some churches will say, hey, we have a building paid for. Why don't we use it for other things? It's here, and then they use things on inappropriate. And I think that might really fit to this issue with the altar. We're going to stop. Thanks so much. Great comments. Next week is Gregor. Gregor is going to bring us chapter 23 and then 24. Be ready for his comments and stuff because poor guy, I really gave him, I shortchanged him on study material. There's not a lot to there. So I gave him a lot of questions to think about. So be sure to look at the questions, have some responses for him so that you can kind of help him out with the material. Because like I said, there's just not a lot, not enough there to, I feel like that I gave him. So the material is online, so grab it and take a look at it and have questions ready to go. Thanks again. And for everybody online, thank you too.